In the shadow-draped palace chambers of ancient Babylon, the master of the known world lay dying. The year was 323 before the Common Era, and Alexander of Macedon, conqueror of Persia, pharaoh of Egypt, king of Asia, struggled for each labored breath in the very city where he had planned to establish the capital of his boundless empire. At just 32 years of age, he possessed dominion over territories stretching from the wine-dark waters of the Aegean to the mysterious rivers of distant India. Yet all the gold of Croesus, all the wisdom of Babylon's ancient libraries, all the devotion of armies that had followed him beyond the edges of the mapped world, none of it could purchase him another sunrise. The great bedchamber, once witness to the ceremonies of Persian kings, now hosted a more solemn ritual. Flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with treasures gathered from 3 continents. The air hung heavy with the scent of frankincense and myrrh, exotic perfumes that could not mask the growing stillness that settled over the room like a burial shroud. Outside these walls, the mighty Euphrates flowed as it had for millennia, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the palace above its banks. His generals gathered in hushed circles, these titans of warfare who had carved their names across history through a decade of unbroken victories. Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Cassander, Antigonus, men who commanded legions and governed provinces, now stood helpless before an enemy no amount of tactical brilliance could defeat. They whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible above the labored breathing that marked the end of an era. The fever had consumed him slowly, then suddenly. For days he had refused to acknowledge its grip, continuing to plan new campaigns, speaking of ships to be built for the conquest of Arabia, of roads to be constructed connecting his vast dominions. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind remained fixed on horizons yet unconquered, on the endless possibility that had driven him since boyhood. As consciousness flickered like a candle in the wind, perhaps his thoughts turned to distant Macedonia, to the mother who had whispered of divine destiny, to the father whose assassination had thrust him onto history's stage. Perhaps he remembered the moment he first set foot on Asian soil and claimed it as spear-won territory, or the thunder of hooves at Gaugamela where the fate of empires hung in the balance. The question that haunted the watching generals finally escaped into the lamplit air. To whom do you leave your kingdom? But the lips that had commanded millions, that had spoken words reshaping the ancient world, could form no answer save the whispered phrase that would echo through history, to the strongest. And so in Babylon, where empires had risen and fallen for 1,000 years before his birth, the greatest conqueror in human memory drew his final breath, leaving behind a legacy that would outlive the very stones of the palace where he died. But to understand how a prince from the rugged mountains of Macedonia came to rule the world, we must journey back to the beginning, to a time when prophecies and omens heralded the birth of someone destined to surpass the achievements of heroes and gods alike. On a summer day in 356 before the Common Era, the gods themselves seemed to smile upon the kingdom of Macedonia. In the royal palace at Pella, Queen Olympias of Epirus brought forth a son amid circumstances so extraordinary that even the most skeptical courtiers whispered of divine intervention. As her cries echoed through the marble corridors, messengers burst through the palace gates bearing news that would transform this birth from royal routine into the stuff of legend. King Philip's armies had crushed the Illyrians in a decisive victory that secured Macedonia's northwestern frontier. His prized racehorse had thundered to triumph at the Olympic Games, bringing honor to the royal house before all of Greece. Most portentous of all, word arrived that the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, had burned to the ground on this very night, as if the goddess of the hunt had abandoned her shrine to attend the birth of a future hunter of men. The child who emerged into this tapestry of omens possessed the blood of 2 formidable lineages. His father, Philip II, had transformed Macedonia from a backward mountain kingdom into the dominant power of northern Greece through revolutionary military tactics and ruthless political cunning. Stocky and battle-scarred, with one eye lost to a siege arrow, Philip embodied the pragmatic warrior king who understood that power flowed from the point of a spear and the weight of gold. His mother presented a stark contrast to her husband's calculated pragmatism. Olympias traced her lineage back to Achilles himself, and her Epirote heritage carried traditions far older and wilder than Macedonian custom. In the torchlit chambers where she practiced the ecstatic rites of Dionysus, she communed with serpents sacred to the god, their scales gleaming like living jewels in the flickering light. Court whispers spoke of her prophetic dreams, of her claim that Zeus himself had visited her in the form of a thunderbolt, making the child she bore divine as well as royal. The marriage between these two powerful personalities had been arranged for political advantage. Philip needed Epirote support for his expanding ambitions, while Olympia's royal house sought Macedonian protection. Yet beneath the diplomatic convenience burned a passionate and volatile relationship that would shape their son's complex psychology. Where Philip calculated, Olympias prophesied. Where he built alliances, she nursed vendettas. Where he conquered through force, she wielded the subtler powers of religious authority and mystical intimidation. The palace at Pella itself reflected this fusion of pragmatic power and exotic mysticism. Recent conquests had filled its treasuries with Thracian gold and southern Greek art, while tribute from subject tribes brought rare furs, amber, and exotic weapons. In the Great Hall where Philip held court, frescoes depicted Macedonian victories alongside mythological scenes, as if mortal achievements deserved equal standing with the deeds of gods and heroes. As the infant Alexander drew his first breath in this world of ambition and omen, the attending priests performed the traditional sacrifices while studying the omens with unusual intensity. The coincidence of so many favorable signs on a single day had never been recorded in Macedonian history. Some whispered that the child was destined to surpass even his accomplished father's achievements. Yet even as divine signs seemed to herald the arrival of someone touched by destiny, darker currents swirled beneath the surface of Macedonian court life, shadows of violence and betrayal that would soon engulf the royal family and forge the character of the future conqueror through fire and blood. The boy who would conquer the world grew up suspended between two opposing forces that would define his extraordinary character. In the training yards of Pella, young Alexander absorbed the harsh lessons of Macedonian warfare under his father's watchful eye. The clash of bronze on bronze echoed across the practice grounds as he learned to wield sword and spear with deadly precision. Philip insisted his heir master every aspect of military craft, not from the safety of royal observation, but through sweat and bruises alongside the sons of Macedonia's nobility. By age 10, the prince could ride a warhorse bareback, strike targets with javelin throws that amazed veteran soldiers, and debate military tactics with an understanding that impressed his father's generals. Yet each evening, when the training horns fell silent, Alexander entered a completely different world within the palace walls. In chambers heavy with incense and mystery, Olympias initiated her son into traditions far older than Macedonian customs. She filled his mind with tales of his divine ancestry, tracing their bloodline back through generations of heroes to Achilles himself. Under flickering torchlight, she would recount the Trojan War with such vivid detail that the boy could almost smell the smoke rising from Ilium's burning towers, almost hear the clash of bronze as his legendary ancestor battled Hector beneath the walls. The fusion of these influences created something unprecedented. Where other royal children learned either warfare or statecraft, Alexander absorbed both with an intensity that unsettled even experienced courtiers. When Persian ambassadors visited Pella during one of Philip's campaigns, the 12-year-old prince astounded them with questions that revealed strategic thinking beyond his years. He inquired about the royal roads construction, the organization of Persian military units, the character of the great king himself, and the distances between major cities of the empire. The ambassadors departed speaking not of Macedonian gold or Philip's military innovations, but of the unnerving intelligence gleaming in the young prince's eyes. This precocious brilliance manifested most dramatically in the legendary encounter with Bucephalus. When horse traders brought the magnificent black stallion to Pella, seasoned horsemen failed to mount the spirited animal. The beast reared and struck at anyone who approached, its eyes rolling white with terror and rage. As Philip prepared to dismiss the traders, declaring the horse unmanageable, 13-year-old Alexander stepped forward with quiet confidence. Where others saw an untamable beast, the young prince observed a crucial detail. Bucephalus feared his own shadow dancing on the ground before him. Approaching calmly, Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, eliminating the frightening shadow. Speaking in soothing tones, he grasped the bridle and vaulted onto the stallion's back in one fluid motion. Horse and rider moved as if they shared a single spirit, galloping across the field in perfect harmony. Philip watched in amazement as his son controlled the powerful animal through understanding rather than force. "My boy," he reportedly declared, "seek a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia is too small for you." But even as these demonstrations of exceptional ability delighted the court, Philip recognized that his heir's remarkable mind required guidance beyond what traditional Macedonian education could provide, leading the king to make a decision that would reshape not only his son's development, but the intellectual destiny of the ancient world. When Alexander reached his 13th year, Philip made a decision that would alter the course of human thought itself. For his son's advanced education, the Macedonian king secured the services of Aristotle, former student of Plato, master of logic, and already recognized as one of the greatest minds in the Greek world. The philosopher, then in his 40s, had spent 2 decades developing revolutionary approaches to understanding politics, ethics, and the natural world. Philip established a dedicated academy at Mieza, a secluded sanctuary of the nymphs where ancient olive groves provided shade for contemplation and crystal springs offered respite from the heat of intellectual discourse. Here, away from the intrigues and distractions of court life, Alexander joined a carefully selected group of young Macedonian nobles who would one day serve as his companions in conquest. Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander, Perdiccas, and others gathered each morning in the dappled sunlight beneath plane trees, their minds shaped by a curriculum unprecedented in its breadth and sophistication. Aristotle's teaching method transformed learning from mere memorization into active exploration. In the morning hours, when the air still carried the coolness of night, the philosopher would lead his students through systematic examinations of political theory, analyzing the constitutions of different city-states, and exploring the principles that made governments stable or unstable. Alexander absorbed these lessons with particular intensity, already envisioning how such knowledge might apply to the territories his father was conquering. As the sun climbed higher, the focus shifted to natural philosophy. Aristotle encouraged his students to observe the world with precision, collecting specimens of plants and animals, studying their behavior, and drawing conclusions based on careful evidence rather than inherited assumptions. The young prince showed remarkable aptitude for this empirical approach, a skill that would later serve him well when encountering the exotic flora and fauna of distant lands. But it was during the afternoon sessions, when shadows grew long across the academy grounds, that Alexander encountered the work that would shape his soul. Aristotle presented him with a specially annotated copy of Homer's Iliad, the epic poem that sang of heroes who chose glory over long life, of warriors who achieved immortality through their deeds on the battlefield. The prince absorbed every line with passionate intensity, memorizing vast passages and carrying the text with him always. In Achilles, his purported ancestor, Alexander found the perfect model of heroic excellence, swift in battle, terrible in wrath, yet capable of profound emotion and nobility. The young student would sleep with the Iliad beneath his pillow alongside his dagger, as if the poem might inspire his dreams with visions of future glory. Under Aristotle's guidance, he learned to see in Homer not mere entertainment, but a handbook for heroic living. The philosopher also introduced his royal pupil to the art of rhetoric, teaching him to construct arguments that could sway assemblies, rally troops, or negotiate with foreign powers. These skills in persuasion, combined with his natural charisma, would prove invaluable when Alexander needed to maintain the loyalty of diverse populations across his expanding empire. Yet perhaps Aristotle's most profound influence lay in teaching Alexander to think systematically about culture and governance. The philosopher's belief in Greek superiority over barbarian peoples would initially shape his students' worldview, though Alexander would eventually transcend these limitations to develop his own revolutionary vision of cultural synthesis. After 3 transformative years at Mieza, the 16-year-old heir had absorbed some of the most advanced thinking of his age, his mind sharpened by philosophy while his ambitions soared toward horizons his teacher could barely imagine. But as intellectual development reached its peak, violent events in Macedonia were about to thrust the young prince from the world of contemplation into the brutal realities of power and survival. The blade that ended Philip's reign flashed in broad daylight during what should have been Macedonia's greatest celebration. The year was 336, and the theater at Igi overflowed with wedding guests from across the Greek world, gathered to witness the marriage of Philip's daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus. The ceremony represented the pinnacle of Philip's diplomatic achievements, a union that would strengthen Macedonia's western frontiers while demonstrating the kingdom's newfound prestige to assembled dignitaries. Golden sunlight streamed through marble columns as musicians played and incense burned on altars dedicated to the gods. Philip himself had never appeared more triumphant. At 54, the scarred veteran of countless campaigns walked with the confidence of a man who had transformed a backward mountain kingdom into the dominant power of Greece. His grand procession included statues of the 12 Olympian gods carried by honored priests, followed by a 13th statue, Philip himself, claiming divine status alongside Zeus and Apollo. The message was unmistakable. Macedonia's king now stood among the immortals. As the royal party moved through the theater's entrance, 20-year-old Alexander and his uncle, the bridegroom, flanked Philip on either side. The crowd rose in respectful silence, awed by this display of Macedonian power and wealth. Yet in that moment of supreme triumph, death walked unseen among the wedding guests. Pausanias, one of Philip's 7 bodyguards, pushed through the throng with murderous purpose. Ancient sources suggest he acted from personal grievance, an insult from Philip's general Attalus that the king had failed to redress adequately. But whispers of deeper conspiracies would echo through history. Persian gold, rival claimants to the throne, or perhaps even Olympias herself, striking before Philip could set aside his troublesome Epirote wife for his new Macedonian bride. The attack came without warning. As Philip walked unguarded between his son and son-in-law, acknowledging the crowd's acclaim, Pausanias struck with a short sword, driving the blade deep into the king's ribs. Philip collapsed onto the marble floor, his royal robes spreading crimson across the white stone as his life ebbed away in mere moments. Chaos erupted throughout the theater. Guests screamed and fled in terror while guards pursued the assassin, who sprinted toward horses he had positioned for escape. But Pausanias stumbled over a vine root in his desperate flight, and the pursuing guards cut him down before he could reveal whether he acted alone or as part of a broader conspiracy. In those critical moments, as Philip's body lay bleeding, Macedonia balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The kingdom faced enemies on every frontier, rivals within the nobility, and a succession that was far from guaranteed. But Alexander moved with the decisive speed that would characterize his entire reign. While others stood paralyzed by shock, the young prince immediately assumed command. He rallied the loyal bodyguards, secured the palace, and dispatched trusted agents to arrest potential rivals before they could organize opposition. By sunset, he had eliminated his cousin Amyntas, Philip's nephew with a strong claim to the throne, along with other relatives who might become focal points for rebellion. Within days, Alexander had convinced the Macedonian assembly to acknowledge him as king, confirming his father's trusted generals in their positions while promising to continue Philip's planned invasion of Persia. His combination of ruthless pragmatism and inspiring rhetoric transformed a potential succession crisis into a seamless transfer of power. But even as Macedonia rallied behind its new young king, word of Philip's death spread like wildfire across Greece, igniting rebellions that would test whether this untested ruler could hold together his father's empire, let alone expand it beyond Philip's wildest dreams. The smoke that rose from Thebes could be seen for 30 miles, a black pillar announcing to all Greece that the young king of Macedonia would tolerate no defiance. Word of Philip's assassination had spread across the Greek world like wildfire, igniting rebellions that seemed to offer hope for freedom from Macedonian dominance. In Athens, orators declared the tyrant dead and called for renewed independence. Theban exiles returned to their city with promises of Athenian support and Persian gold. From the Aegean islands to the mountains of Arcadia, Greek cities began mobilizing armies and forming alliances against what they assumed would be a weak and inexperienced successor to Philip's throne. They had gravely underestimated Alexander's speed and determination. While Greek ambassadors still debated in their assemblies, the 20-year-old king was already marching south with the full Macedonian army. His forces covered the distance from Pella to Thessaly in just 5 days, a pace that left enemy scouts breathless and Greek commanders scrambling to organize defenses they thought they had weeks to prepare. At the narrow pass of Tempe, where Thessalian forces had positioned themselves to block the Macedonian advance, Alexander demonstrated the tactical innovation that would become his hallmark. Rather than assault the fortified position directly, he led his troops along treacherous mountain paths that local guides claimed were impassable for an army. Working through the night with ropes and iron pegs, Macedonian engineers carved a route through terrain no enemy expected them to traverse. Dawn revealed Macedonian forces above and behind the Thessalian positions, appearing like avenging spirits where no mortal army should have been able to reach. Faced with this impossible maneuver, the Thessalians surrendered without battle, their confidence shattered by encountering an opponent who achieved the seemingly impossible through audacity and superior preparation. At Thermopylae, where Leonidas had once made his famous stand, Greek Confederate forces waited to make their own heroic resistance. But when Macedonian banners appeared on the horizon, the coalition dissolved. Representatives approached Alexander's camp under flags of truce, offering submission rather than facing the fate that awaited those who defied the young king's authority. Only Thebes remained defiant. The ancient city that had briefly ruled Greece under Epaminondas now committed itself to a desperate gamble for independence. Theban leaders, encouraged by promises of support that would never arrive, declared their intention to fight to the death rather than submit to Macedonian rule. They strengthened their walls, gathered supplies for a long siege, and prepared to show Greece that some cities still possessed the courage of their ancestors. Alexander's response combined psychological warfare with overwhelming force. He positioned his army within sight of Thebes's walls, allowing the defenders to observe the disciplined formations and gleaming weapons of troops who had never known defeat. For days, he offered increasingly generous terms of surrender, demonstrating both his willingness to show mercy and his confidence in ultimate victory. When these offers were contemptuously refused, the young king unleashed the full fury of Macedonian military might. The assault began at dawn with a coordinated attack on multiple sections of the city's defenses. Siege engines hurled massive stones against ancient walls while elite troops scaled ladders under cover of protective shields. The fighting was desperate and bloody, with Theban defenders showing the courage their leaders had promised. But Macedonian discipline and superior equipment gradually overwhelmed heroic resistance. When the walls finally cracked and Macedonian forces poured into the city's streets, Alexander faced a decision that would define his reign's character. Rather than accepting surrender and limiting destruction, he allowed his troops to sack Thebes completely. Ancient sources report 6,000 Thebans killed in the fighting, with 30,000 survivors sold into slavery. Buildings were systematically destroyed, leaving only temples and the house of the poet Pindar standing amid the ruins. This calculated brutality served a strategic purpose beyond mere revenge. The destruction of Thebes sent an unmistakable message throughout the Greek world. Rebellion against Macedonian authority would be met with annihilation. Athens, which had encouraged Theban resistance, hastily sent ambassadors offering complete submission. Other Greek cities followed suit, preferring accommodation to destruction. With Greece subdued through this devastating combination of speed, tactical brilliance, and strategic terror, Alexander had secured his European frontiers and demonstrated the ruthless competence that would characterize his reign. Now, with his father's empire consolidated and expanded, the young conqueror could turn his attention eastward toward the prize that had eluded every Greek leader since the Persian Wars, the conquest of the mighty Persian Empire itself. In the spring of 334, Alexander stood at the edge of two worlds, separated by a mile of wine-dark water that had divided Europe from Asia since the dawn of time. The Hellespont stretched before the Macedonian army like a liquid boundary between the familiar and the unknown. Here, where the myths claimed Leander had swum nightly to reach his beloved hero, where Xerxes had once bridged the strait with boats to bring his vast Persian host against Greece, Alexander prepared to reverse the tide of history itself. The morning sun painted the waters gold as transport ships bobbed at anchor, ready to carry 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry across the narrow strait that separated continents. But before the main army made its crossing, Alexander sailed ahead with a select contingent, driven by a compulsion that transcended military necessity. As his trireme approached the Asian shore, he stood at the prow with a spear in his hand, his purple cloak streaming in the salt breeze. The moment the keels scraped against the foreign beach, he hurled the weapon deep into the sand, claiming all of Asia as spear-won territory by right of conquest. This theatrical gesture announced his intentions to both gods and men. He had come not merely to raid or punish, but to claim permanent dominion over the Persian Empire and whatever lay beyond. The spear quivering in Asian soil served as both declaration and prophecy, marking the moment when the greatest conquest in human history officially began. From the landing point, Alexander led a smaller company on a pilgrimage that revealed the mythic framework through which he understood his mission. 20 miles south of the Hellespont lay the windswept plain of Troy, where heroes had once fought for glory that would echo through eternity. The ruins of Ilium rose from coastal meadows where spring flowers bloomed among ancient stones, nature reclaiming what war had devastated centuries before. In the sanctuary of Athena, Alexander performed sacrifices to the goddess of wisdom and war, seeking divine favor for the campaigns ahead. But his most significant act was claiming an ancient shield from the temple's collection, a bronze masterpiece said to date from the legendary siege itself. According to tradition, this shield had belonged to one of the heroes who fought beneath Troy's walls, connecting Alexander directly to the epic struggle that had shaped Greek imagination for generations. He and Hephaestion also performed a ceremony of profound personal significance, laying wreaths at the supposed tombs of Achilles and Patroclus. The two young men, bound by friendship as deep as their legendary predecessors, honored the warrior whose glory Alexander sought to surpass and whose tragic fate he seemed willing to accept. If Achilles had chosen a short life crowned with eternal fame over long years in obscurity, Alexander appeared ready to make the same bargain with destiny. As he stood among the ruins where heroes had won immortality through their deeds, Alexander transformed his invasion from a mere military campaign into the continuation of an ancient story. The Persian War would become his Iliad, with himself cast as the greatest hero of all. The shield of Troy would accompany him across 3 continents, a tangible link to the mythic past he sought to join. These symbolic acts complete, Alexander rejoined his army as the main crossing began in earnest. Transport after transport ferried men, horses, and equipment across the strait while Persian scouts watched from distant hilltops, reporting to their commanders that the threat Philip had planned was now becoming reality under his son's leadership. The last ship to cross carried Alexander himself, standing once again at the prow as Asia's coastline grew larger with each pull of the oars. Behind him lay the familiar world of Greece and Macedonia. Ahead stretched the vast Persian Empire, wealthy beyond imagination but ruled by a king who had never faced an opponent like the young Macedonian now setting foot on his territories with divine ambitions and the tactical genius to achieve them. The muddy waters of the Granicus River ran red with Persian blood as Alexander won his first victory on Asian soil and nearly lost his life in the same brutal hour. Just 3 days after crossing the Hellespont, the Macedonian army encountered its first serious opposition along the banks of a minor tributary that would become famous throughout the ancient world. Persian satraps from the western provinces had gathered their forces, 20,000 infantry and an equal number of cavalry, positioning themselves along the river's eastern bank in what appeared to be an impregnable defensive line. The Granicus flowed swiftly between steep banks lined with treacherous mud, its waters swollen by spring rains that made crossing hazardous even without enemy opposition. Persian commanders, confident in their position, expected the young Macedonian king to make camp and rest his troops after their march, allowing time for negotiation or perhaps a more cautious approach to the river crossing. They had not reckoned with Alexander's revolutionary approach to warfare. Against the advice of Parmenion, his most experienced general, Alexander ordered an immediate assault toward evening while the sun hung low in the western sky. When his lieutenant counseled waiting until dawn for better conditions, the young king's response revealed both his tactical insight and growing sense of destiny. The Hellespont would blush with shame if, having crossed it, we feared this little stream. The battle unfolded in phases that showcased the integrated tactics Philip had developed and Alexander was perfecting. First, light infantry crossed at several points, drawing Persian cavalry down to the water's edge where their superior numbers meant less on the narrow shoreline. Then, as Persian attention focused on these diversionary attacks, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a diagonal charge across the river at an unexpected angle. The crossing itself demonstrated the young king's understanding that leadership meant sharing danger rather than directing from safety. Plunging his horse Bucephalus into the treacherous current, Alexander charged toward the densest concentration of Persian nobles, his distinctive white-plumed helmet making him an unmistakable target for enemy champions seeking glory. What followed was hand-to-hand combat of legendary ferocity. Persian aristocrats, magnificent in their scaled armor and flowing robes, met Macedonian cavalry in a thunderous clash of bronze and iron. Spears shattered against shields, while swords rang against armor as individual combats erupted across the muddy riverbank. In the midst of this melee, Alexander faced a moment that could have ended both his life and his ambitions before they had truly begun. Engaged in desperate combat with multiple Persian nobles, he failed to notice Spithridates approaching from behind with raised sword, poised to deliver a killing blow. Death approached unseen until Cleitus the Black, one of Alexander's childhood companions, severed the Persian's sword arm with a desperate stroke that sent blood spraying across the young king's white plume. This near-death experience seemed to energize rather than caution Alexander. Fighting with what observers described as superhuman fury, he carved through Persian ranks toward their command position, targeting the enemy leadership with tactical precision that would become his trademark. The sight of their supposedly invincible king fighting in the front ranks, bleeding but unbroken, inspired his men to superhuman efforts while demoralizing Persian troops who had expected to face a more conventional opponent. When Persian resistance finally collapsed, the victory's completeness astonished even Macedonian veterans. Thousands of Persian cavalry lay dead along the riverbank while their infantry, mostly Greek mercenaries, found themselves surrounded and facing annihilation. In a decision that revealed both pragmatism and propaganda value, Alexander offered quarter to Persian survivors while ordering the systematic slaughter of Greek mercenaries who had fought against their own people for foreign gold. The aftermath of Granicus established patterns that would define Alexander's entire campaign. His willingness to fight in the front ranks had nearly cost him his life, but created fanatical loyalty among his troops, who saw their king sharing their dangers rather than merely commanding from a distance. The targeting of enemy leadership had disrupted Persian command structures more effectively than simple battlefield victory. Most significantly, the speed and decisiveness of the victory sent shock waves throughout the Persian Empire, announcing that a new type of opponent had entered Asia, one who combined tactical brilliance with personal courage and refused to accept the limitations that had constrained previous Greek expeditions. But as news of the Granicus victory spread eastward along the royal road, it reached the ears of Darius III, the great king himself, who began mobilizing resources that would dwarf anything Alexander had yet encountered. For the first time in Persian history, the great king abandoned his army in the face of a charging enemy, transforming victory into catastrophic rout through a single moment of royal cowardice. The narrow coastal plain near Issus, where modern Turkey meets Syria, seemed an unlikely stage for one of history's most decisive battles. Yet here, in the autumn of 333, the full might of the Persian Empire under Darius III would collide with Alexander's veteran army in a confrontation that would determine the fate of two civilizations. The battle's approach had unfolded like a deadly game of chess across the eastern Mediterranean. While Alexander secured Greek cities along the Aegean coast, Darius had spent months assembling forces from across his vast empire, immortals from Persia's heartland, cavalry from the steppes, archers from Scythia, and contingents representing dozens of subject peoples. Ancient sources suggest his army numbered between 200,000 and 600,000 troops, a host so vast it took hours to pass a single point. In a brilliant strategic maneuver that caught Alexander completely off guard, Darius marched his immense force behind the Macedonian army, cutting their supply lines and positioning himself between the invaders and their homeland. When Alexander learned of this development through captured Persian scouts, he immediately reversed course, leading his troops through the mountain passes that separated the two armies. The resulting encounter surprised both commanders. The battlefield at Issus, constrained by mountains on one side and the Mediterranean on the other, prevented Darius from deploying his overwhelming numerical advantage. The narrow coastal plain, crossed by the Pinaris River, would force the Persians to fight on a front little wider than their opponents could match. Alexander surveyed the terrain with the tactical eye that had made him legendary. The river crossing would disrupt Persian cavalry charges, while the confined space neutralized their superior numbers. He positioned his forces with characteristic attention to geography, the Thessalian cavalry on his left near the sea, the phalanx holding the center, and his companion cavalry on the right wing where he would personally lead the decisive assault. Across the river, Darius arrayed his forces in the traditional Persian manner. The great king himself commanded from the center, standing in a magnificent chariot surrounded by his immortals and royal kinsmen. His golden armor blazed in the morning sun while peacock feathers adorned his tiara, creating a spectacle designed to inspire his troops and intimidate his enemies. The battle opened with skirmishing as light troops tested each other's positions across the swift-flowing Pinaris. Then Alexander demonstrated the tactical innovation that had become his signature, an oblique advance that drew Persian forces toward him while creating gaps in their defensive line. As the Macedonian phalanx engaged Persian infantry in the center, Alexander spotted the moment he had been waiting for. Leading his companion cavalry in their trademark wedge formation, he charged directly across the river toward Darius's position, his white-plumed helmet making him unmistakable among the press of fighting men. The charge embodied everything Alexander had learned about warfare and leadership. Rather than striking at the Persian flanks where victory might come easier, he aimed for the army's heart, the golden figure of the great king himself. Persian nobles fought desperately to protect their sovereign, their bronze armor ringing under Macedonian spears as the cavalry wedge drove deeper into their ranks. For crucial minutes, the outcome hung in balance as the finest warriors of two empires clashed around the Persian royal standard. Javelins flew toward the distinctive chariot while Darius's kinsmen fell one by one, their bodies forming a protective wall of the dead around their king. Then came the moment that would echo through history. As Macedonian cavalry pressed ever closer and defeat seemed imminent, Darius III, whose ancestors had ruled the known world for 2 centuries, chose personal survival over royal honor. Abandoning his chariot and the men dying to protect him, the great king fled the battlefield on horseback, his purple robe streaming behind him as he galloped toward the mountains. The psychological impact of the royal flight proved devastating. Persian troops who had been fighting with determination witnessed their god-king's cowardice and lost the will to resist. What had been an organized defense collapsed into panicked rout as units across the battlefield abandoned their positions to follow their sovereign's example. In the abandoned Persian camp, Alexander's troops discovered wealth beyond their wildest imagination. Gold and silver vessels, precious fabrics, exotic spices, and artistic treasures that represented the accumulated luxury of the world's richest empire. But the most significant prize was human: Darius's mother Sisigambis, his wife Statera, and his children, all captured as they waited for news of the battle's outcome. Alexander's treatment of these royal captives revealed both political calculation and genuine nobility. Rather than subjecting them to the customary fate of high-ranking prisoners, he visited their tent personally, assuring the Persian queen mother that her sons still lived and that they would be treated with the honor due their station. When the elderly Sisigambis accidentally prostrated herself before Hephaestion, mistaking the tall, handsome officer for Alexander himself, the young king's response became legendary. "You were not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." This gracious gesture, combined with his respectful treatment of the royal women, created a powerful contrast with typical ancient warfare practices. But even as Alexander savored this triumph that had shattered Persian prestige and filled his treasury with unimaginable wealth, one unconquered fortress still blocked his path southward, presenting what seemed like an impossible challenge that would test his engineering genius to its very limits. When Alexander declared he would walk on water to reach the island fortress of Tyre, even his most devoted followers wondered if their king had finally attempted the impossible. The ancient Phoenician city rose from the Mediterranean like a stone mountain, its massive walls climbing 150 feet directly from the waves that had protected it for centuries. Half a mile of deep blue water separated the island from the Lebanese coast, while Tyrian warships patrolled the surrounding seas with the confidence of a people who had never been conquered by land-based armies. From their ramparts, the defenders could see Alexander's forces gathering on the distant shore like ants contemplating the assault of a giant. When Alexander's ambassadors arrived under flags of truce, requesting permission to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom Greeks identified with Heracles, the Tyrian response was both diplomatic and defiant. They offered submission in principle while refusing the specific request that would acknowledge Macedonian authority within their sacred precincts. To Alexander, this represented unacceptable defiance that threatened his carefully constructed image of invincibility. Other commanders might have bypassed this single resistant city, but Alexander understood that leaving such a prominent fortress unconquered would undermine his entire campaign. Tyre's powerful navy could serve as a Persian base behind his advancing army, while its successful resistance might inspire other cities to rebel. The impossible would have to become possible. His solution defied both engineering logic and natural law. If he could not reach Tyre by sea, he would transform the very geography of the coastline. Alexander ordered the construction of a mole, a massive stone causeway extending from the mainland directly to the island through waters 20 feet deep. The project began with the systematic deforestation of the Lebanese mountains. Thousands of cedar trees, some ancient beyond memory, crashed to earth under Macedonian axes as work crews dragged the massive trunks to the shoreline. Engineers drove wooden piles deep into the seabed, creating a foundation strong enough to support the weight of stones and rubble that would form the causeway's body. For weeks, the work proceeded under constant harassment. Tyrian ships approached the construction site daily, raining arrows and catapult bolts on the exposed workers while their artillery hurled massive stones from the city walls. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles, as currents and tides washed away material almost as quickly as it could be placed. As the mole approached the island, the water deepened and the currents strengthened, making construction exponentially more difficult. Alexander responded by widening the causeway and building floating barriers to protect his workers from Tyrian naval attacks. Giant siege towers, taller than any previously constructed, rose from the advancing stonework to provide covering fire for the engineers below. The Tyrians countered with desperate ingenuity. They loaded an old cargo vessel with pitch, sulfur, and dry wood, creating a massive fire ship that they sailed directly into the mole's advanced section during a favorable wind. The resulting conflagration destroyed months of work in a single night, consuming the siege towers and much of the causeway's wooden framework in flames that could be seen for miles along the coast. Lesser commanders would have abandoned the seemingly futile effort, but Alexander's response revealed the adaptive genius that made him unbeatable. Recognizing that he needed naval superiority to complement his land-based approach, he launched a diplomatic offensive that proved as effective as his engineering efforts. In a remarkable achievement that demonstrated his growing understanding of Eastern politics, Alexander persuaded the Phoenician cities already under his control to provide warships against their sister city. Cyprus contributed additional vessels, while other allied states sent both ships and crews. Within weeks, the young king had assembled a fleet of over 200 warships that outnumbered and outmatched Tyre's naval forces. With control of the surrounding waters secured, Alexander resumed construction of the mole while preparing the most sophisticated siege equipment the ancient world had yet seen. Floating platforms carried artillery towers that rose even higher than the city's massive walls, while engineers developed new techniques for breaching fortifications that had resisted every previous attacker. After 7 months of continuous effort that had cost thousands of lives and consumed vast resources, Macedonian forces finally breached Tyre's defenses. The final assault combined the reconstructed causeway with coordinated naval attacks from multiple directions, overwhelming defenders who had fought with legendary courage but could not resist the convergence of sea and land power. Alexander's response to victory revealed both the strategic calculation and frightening ruthlessness that characterized his leadership. The fall of Tyre was followed by terrible vengeance: 8,000 Tyrians killed in the final fighting, 30,000 survivors sold into slavery, and mass crucifixions along the shoreline that served as grim warnings to other cities contemplating resistance. Yet even as smoke rose from the conquered fortress, Alexander's thoughts had already turned southward toward a land of ancient mysteries where pharaohs claimed divine authority and priests possessed wisdom older than Greek civilization itself. In the shadow of the pyramids, Alexander underwent a transformation that would alter not only his own destiny, but his conception of what it meant to be human. Egypt welcomed the Macedonian conqueror not as an invader, but as a liberator from Persian rule that had never sat comfortably on the ancient land of the pharaohs. Mazaces, the Persian satrap, recognized the futility of resistance after witnessing the fate of Tyre and Gaza. He surrendered the province intact, delivering to Alexander a realm whose antiquity and wealth dwarfed even Persian splendor. The young king entered Egypt with profound respect for traditions that stretched back 3 millennia before his birth. Unlike the harsh Persian overlords who had shown contempt for local customs, Alexander made elaborate sacrifices to Egyptian gods, particularly the sacred Apis bull in Memphis. Egyptian priests, impressed by this reverence for their ancient ways, welcomed him not merely as a conqueror, but as a legitimate pharaoh blessed by the gods themselves. At the mouth of the Nile, where the great river met the Mediterranean, Alexander chose the site for what would become his most enduring physical legacy. Standing on a narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Merodes, he personally laid out the plan for Alexandria with his own hands, using barley meal to mark the streets when no chalk could be found. When birds descended to eat the grain, his seers proclaimed it an omen that the city would feed the world, a prophecy that would prove remarkably accurate. The planned city embodied Alexander's vision of cultural fusion. Its grid pattern followed Greek principles of urban design, while its location facilitated trade between the Mediterranean world and the ancient civilizations of the Nile. From its inception, Alexandria was designed to be more than a military garrison or administrative center. It would become a crucible where Greek learning could merge with Egyptian wisdom and Eastern knowledge. But even as Alexander organized Egypt's administration and initiated construction of his great city, a deeper compulsion drew him toward the western desert, where one of the world's most ancient oracles waited in an oasis beyond the reach of normal human travel. The journey to Siwa defied both practical necessity and military logic. While his army consolidated control over Egypt's strategic points, Alexander set out across the Libyan desert with a small company of companions, driven by what seemed like divine summons toward a destination where few mortals had ever ventured. The expedition faced perils that made battlefield dangers seem trivial. The desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that could kill the unwary through heat that turned bronze armor into instruments of torture. Water sources were separated by days of travel across shifting sands where a wrong turn meant death by thirst. Sandstorms could arise without warning, erasing landmarks and disorienting even experienced guides. Ancient sources describe supernatural assistance during this perilous journey, flights of ravens that led the way when guides became lost, sudden rainstorms that replenished empty water skins, and cool breezes that provided relief during the desert's most punishing passages. Whether divine intervention or fortunate coincidence, Alexander's company reached the sacred oasis after days of travel that tested their endurance to its limits. Siwa itself seemed like a fragment of paradise transplanted into the heart of desolation. Palm trees clustered around springs of sweet water, while ancient temples dedicated to Amun rose from gardens that bloomed impossibly in the surrounding wasteland. The oracle sanctuary, already ancient when the pyramids were young, emanated an atmosphere of timeless mystery that impressed even Alexander's battle-hardened companions. What transpired within the inner sanctuary remains one of history's great secrets. Alexander entered alone to consult the oracle, leaving even Hephaestion outside while priests of Amun conducted rituals in the chamber's sacred darkness. The exact words exchanged were never revealed, but Alexander emerged profoundly transformed. According to later accounts, the oracle addressed him as the son of Amun, whom Greeks identified with Zeus, and prophesied unmatched success in all his endeavors. This divine proclamation aligned perfectly with Egyptian concepts of pharaonic authority, where kings were considered literal children of the sun god. But for a Macedonian raised in Greek traditions, such claims represented a revolutionary leap beyond normal human status. The psychological impact of this experience proved permanent and profound. While Alexander had previously claimed descent from Heracles and Achilles through mortal bloodlines, the Siwa encounter suggested direct divine parentage. This notion, initially shocking to traditional Macedonians, would increasingly influence his behavior and expectations. Alexander's emergence from the desert marked the beginning of a new phase in both his reign and his self-conception. No longer merely a Macedonian king leading Greek forces against Persian enemies, he now saw himself as divinely appointed ruler whose authority transcended ethnic boundaries and cultural limitations. But even as Alexander absorbed the transformative implications of his desert revelation, urgent messages arrived from his scouts in the north, reporting that Darius III had used the time purchased by Tyre's resistance to assemble the largest army in Persian history for a final confrontation that would determine which man truly deserved to rule the world. On the plains of Gaugamela, the greatest army ever assembled in human history prepared to crush 40,000 Macedonians in a battle that would reshape the ancient world forever. The vast expanse near the ancient city of Arbela in modern Iraq stretched endlessly under the autumn sky of 331, its flat terrain carefully chosen and prepared by Darius III to maximize every advantage his enormous host possessed. Persian engineers had spent weeks leveling the ground, removing obstacles that might impede the charge of scythed chariots, and creating the perfect killing field for what the great king intended to be Alexander's final battle. The forces arrayed against the Macedonian army defied comprehension. Ancient sources speak of numbers ranging from 200,000 to over 1 million troops drawn from every corner of the Persian Empire. Bactrian and Sogdian cavalry from Central Asia sat their horses beside Indian war elephants that trumpeted challenges across the morning air. Scythian archers checked their bowstrings, while Armenian and Cappadocian horsemen adjusted armor that gleamed like stars across the endless battle line. Most fearsome were the scythed chariots, Persian innovations with razor-sharp blades extending from their wheels and axles, designed to carve bloody lanes through infantry formations. 15 war elephants from India, creatures of nightmare to troops who had never seen such beasts, flanked the Persian center where Darius himself commanded from a magnificent chariot surrounded by his immortals and kinsmen. Against this overwhelming display of Eastern might, Alexander deployed barely 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Yet these were veterans hardened by 3 years of continuous campaigning, men who had never known defeat and believed their young king could achieve the impossible through tactical brilliance and divine favor. The night before battle revealed Alexander's complex psychology at its most striking. While Persian campfires made the plains look like a constellation fallen to earth, he slept soundly in his tent. When the anxious Parmenians suggested a night attack to offset their numerical disadvantage, Alexander's response captured both supreme confidence and theatrical sensibility. "I will not steal my victory." Dawn revealed the full spectacle of Darius's assembled might stretching beyond the horizon in both directions. The Persian king had positioned his strongest cavalry on the wings, intending to envelop and destroy the smaller Macedonian force through sheer weight of numbers. His scythed chariots waited at the front, ready to smash through enemy lines before the main assault began. Alexander arranged his forces with the tactical sophistication that had made him legendary. The phalanx held the center while Thessalian cavalry anchored his left under Parmenian's command. On his right wing, he positioned his companion cavalry in an oblique formation, creating additional infantry units in echelon to protect against flanking maneuvers. Most innovatively, he established a second line of infantry behind his main formation, troops who could face about if Persians succeeded in enveloping his army, ensuring that even encirclement would not mean destruction. As the armies closed, Darius launched his fearsome chariots against the Macedonian lines. But Alexander had prepared his troops for exactly this threat, creating predetermined gaps in his formation through which the chariots could pass harmlessly. Disciplined soldiers stepped aside at the last moment while archers and javelin throwers targeted the drivers, turning Darius's most terrifying weapon into a tactical liability. The battle's decisive moment came when Alexander, observing Persian cavalry shifting leftward to outflank his position, led his companion cavalry in a diagonal advance toward a gap that developed in the enemy center. This movement, simultaneously defensive and offensive, drew Persian forces away from their planned positions while creating the opening Alexander had been waiting for. Forming his cavalry into the trademark wedge formation that had become his signature, Alexander drove directly toward Darius's position with the focused intensity of a lightning bolt seeking the tallest tree. The charge embodied everything he had learned about warfare and leadership: concentrate maximum force at the decisive point while maintaining the flexibility to exploit emerging opportunities. Persian resistance around their king was desperate and heroic. Darius's kinsmen and bodyguards fought with the courage of men defending not just their sovereign, but their civilization's survival. Bodies piled around the royal chariot as the finest warriors of Asia died trying to stop the inexorable advance of Macedonian cavalry. For crucial minutes, the outcome balanced on the edge of catastrophe or triumph. Then, faced with the approaching wedge of enemy cavalry and the sight of his defenders falling around him, Darius III made the same choice that had cost him at Issus. Abandoning his army and his honor, the great king fled the battlefield, his purple robe streaming behind him as he galloped toward the mountains. The psychological impact of this second royal flight proved catastrophic for Persian morale. Troops who had been fighting determinedly witnessed their god-king's cowardice and lost all will to resist. The organized defense collapsed into chaotic retreat as panic spread like wildfire through the massive army. The pursuit that followed was merciless and complete. Macedonian cavalry hunted fleeing Persians across miles of desert while infantry units systematically destroyed abandoned equipment and supply trains. By sunset, the greatest military force in Persian history had ceased to exist as an organized entity. In the aftermath of Gaugamela, Alexander assumed the title King of Asia, claiming Darius's position as his rightful inheritance rather than mere conquest. This symbolic transformation marked his evolution from Macedonian king leading a Greek coalition to the legitimate successor of Persian imperial authority. But even as news of victory spread across the ancient world, announcing the end of Persian dominance and the beginning of Macedonian hegemony, Alexander faced challenges that would test not his military genius, but his ability to transform conquest into lasting governance of the most diverse empire the world had ever known. The flames that consumed Persepolis lit the night sky like a second sun, erasing in a single evening the architectural legacy of 2 centuries of Persian imperial glory. The road to the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire had led Alexander's victorious army through the Persian gates, a narrow mountain pass where the satrap Ariobarzanes made one final desperate stand to protect the sacred capital. Rather than assault the fortified position directly, Alexander demonstrated once again his gift for achieving the impossible through audacious maneuver. Leaving part of his force to pin the defenders in place, he led a select company along treacherous mountain paths that local shepherds claimed were impassable for armed men. The night march through trackless peaks tested even veteran troops accustomed to Alexander's demands for superhuman effort. Soldiers picked their way along precipices where a single misstep meant death on the rocks below, while bitter mountain winds cut through their cloaks like Persian blades. When dawn revealed Macedonian forces above and behind the Persian position, Ariobarzanes found himself trapped between hammer and anvil with no avenue for escape. Persepolis itself surrendered without resistance, its massive gates opening to reveal treasures that dwarfed even the riches of Babylon and Susa. The royal palace complex, built across generations by Darius I, Xerxes, and their successors, stood as the ultimate symbol of Persian might. Here rested the accumulated wealth of the world's greatest empire, gold and silver beyond counting, precious gems that caught torchlight like captured stars, artistic masterpieces gathered from across 3 continents. For 4 months, Alexander's army remained in Persepolis, resting from their campaigns while 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels labored to transport the royal treasury. The vast halls echoed with Macedonian voices as soldiers who had grown up in simple mountain villages wandered through chambers where Persian kings had received tribute from the ends of the earth. During this interlude, the contradictions in Alexander's position became increasingly apparent. To his Persian subjects, he presented himself as the legitimate heir to Darius, upholding imperial continuity and respecting ancient traditions. To his Macedonian veterans, he remained the champion of Greek civilization, the avenger come to punish Persian aggression dating back to Xerxes' invasion. These tensions reached their climax on a spring evening that began with celebration and ended with one of history's most spectacular acts of destruction. After a symposium heavy with wine and rhetoric, Alexander and his companions made their way to the ceremonial palaces where Persian kings had held court for generations. What happened next became one of the most debated events in ancient history. Some sources suggest the burning was a calculated political statement, a deliberate signal that Persian imperial power had ended forever. Others claim it represented spontaneous vengeance for Xerxes' destruction of Athens a century and a half earlier. The most colorful account attributes the suggestion to Tyre, an Athenian courtesan who accompanied the expedition, proposing that Greek women should light the fires that consumed the palace of Greece's ancient enemy. The flames began in the great audience hall where Persian kings had received homage from the world's rulers. Torches touched wooden beams that had stood for generations, igniting cedar timbers imported from Lebanon and decorative elements crafted from precious materials. As fire spread through the interconnected buildings, the night sky blazed with colors that painted the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Whatever sparked the conflagration, calculated revenge, wine-fueled impulse, or theatrical gesture, its symbolic meaning was unmistakable. The palace complex that had embodied Persian imperial authority for 2 centuries was being reduced to ash and memory. Ancient reliefs depicting tribute bearers from across the empire cracked and fell as limestone heated beyond endurance. By dawn, the ceremonial heart of Persian civilization lay in smoldering ruins. The practical administrative buildings remained intact, but the structures that had symbolized Persian royal ideology were gone forever. Alexander himself may have regretted the destruction once sober reflection replaced wine-induced passion, but the deed could not be undone. The burning of Persepolis marked a point of no return in Alexander's transformation. He could no longer credibly claim to be merely punishing Persian aggression or liberating Greek cities. By destroying the empire's ceremonial center, he had assumed responsibility for creating something new to replace what he had eliminated. This symbolic destruction would prove prophetic, for even as the ashes of Persepolis still smoldered, urgent news arrived from the north that would complete Alexander's transformation from Persian conqueror to the self-proclaimed defender of Persian royal legitimacy against treacherous usurpers. The death of Darius III transformed Alexander from conqueror into avenger, launching him on a pursuit that would carry his army beyond the edges of the known world into lands where the very nature of warfare would be redefined. Word reached Alexander near Ecbatana that Bessus, satrap of Bactria and cousin to the great king, had placed Darius under arrest as Persian resistance crumbled following Gaugamela. This treachery changed everything about the pursuit. No longer chasing an enemy monarch, Alexander now positioned himself as the legitimate defender of Persian royal authority against criminal usurpers who had violated the most sacred bonds of loyalty. Driving his elite units at a pace that tested human endurance, Alexander closed the distance to the fleeing conspirators with relentless determination. His cavalry covered ground that would have taken normal armies weeks to traverse, pushing through the scorching heat of the Iranian plateau while their quarry's lead diminished with each passing day. The pursuit's climax came in the wilderness between Ecbatana and the Caspian Gates. In their desperation to escape, Bessus and his fellow conspirators turned on their captive king with fatal violence. When Alexander's advance guard finally overtook the Persian remnants, they found Darius dying from multiple stab wounds, abandoned by the roadside like a common criminal rather than the ruler of the world's greatest empire. Ancient sources describe Alexander's reaction to this discovery with profound emotion. Dismounting from Bucephalus, he covered the dying king with his own royal cloak while offering water from his personal supply. Whether this poignant encounter actually occurred or represents later embellishment, it perfectly captured Alexander's transformation from Persian enemy to Persian avenger. The symbolic importance of this moment resonated throughout the empire. By honoring Darius in death and vowing to punish his murderers, Alexander positioned himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful successor to Persian imperial authority. This claim would prove crucial as he ventured into territories where Persian legitimacy carried more weight than Macedonian military victory. The pursuit of Bessus led into regions that challenged every assumption about warfare and governance that Alexander had developed during his Mediterranean campaigns. Beyond the Oxus River lay Bactria and Sogdiana, territories corresponding to modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, where vast distances, harsh terrain, and fiercely independent populations created conditions unlike anything his army had previously encountered. Here, among remote mountain valleys and endless steppes, the Macedonians faced enemies who refused to fight set-piece battles or defend fixed positions. Sogdian and Bactrian nobles commanded the loyalty of superb horsemen who could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, then vanish into landscapes they knew intimately. These warriors employed hit-and-run tactics that neutralized many Macedonian advantages while exploiting the vulnerabilities of an army operating far from its bases. Bessus himself, now claiming the title Artaxerxes V and asserting his right to the Persian throne, attempted to rally resistance using traditional reverence for royal bloodline. But his support proved limited among nobles who questioned his legitimacy and feared Macedonian retribution. When Alexander's relentless pursuit finally cornered the usurper, his own followers delivered him in chains rather than face the consequences of continued defiance. The execution of Bessus followed Persian rather than Macedonian custom, demonstrating Alexander's adoption of Eastern judicial practices. The usurper suffered mutilation before death, a traditional punishment for those who violated royal authority, while Alexander presided over proceedings conducted according to Persian law rather than Greek practice. Yet capturing Bessus did not pacify these eastern territories. Unlike the centralized Persian provinces to the west, Bactria and Sogdiana consisted of hundreds of semi-independent domains controlled by local aristocracy who owed no allegiance to distant authority. These nobles commanded nearly impregnable mountain fortresses and maintained private armies of warriors who had never submitted to foreign rule. The most formidable of these resistors was Spitamenes, a Sogdian noble who possessed both the tactical genius to confound Macedonian forces and the charisma to unite traditionally fractious tribes against the common threat. Under his leadership, the rebellion took on new dimensions that tested Alexander's adaptability as never before. Spitamenes understood that he could not match Macedonian forces in direct combat, so he developed a strategy of perpetual motion that kept his enemies off balance while avoiding decisive confrontation. His warriors would strike isolated garrisons, ambush supply convoys, then disappear into terrain where pursuing cavalry found only empty horizons and hostile silence. This cat-and-mouse warfare continued for months, wearing down Macedonian morale while demonstrating that conquest and control were entirely different achievements. Alexander found himself ruling territories during the day that belonged to his enemies by night, facing the exhausting reality that military victory did not automatically translate into political submission. The frustrations of this new type of warfare began to affect both Alexander's strategic thinking and his relationship with his Macedonian veterans, who had followed him willingly into conventional battles, but struggled to understand the purpose of endless campaigns against enemies who would not stand and fight like honorable opponents. In a wine-soaked moment of rage, Alexander murdered the man who had saved his life, shattering bonds of friendship that had endured since childhood and revealing the monster that absolute power was creating. The banquet hall in Maracanda, modern Samarkand, glowed with the warm light of oil lamps as Alexander's inner circle gathered for what should have been a celebration of recent victories against Sogdian rebels. Outside the palace walls, the ancient Silk Road city slumbered under Central Asian stars, while inside, wine flowed freely among companions who had shared the hardships and glories of 4 years' continuous campaigning. The evening began with traditional Macedonian revelry, but beneath the surface lurked tensions that had been building for months. Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, the elaborate court dress, the introduction of proskenses, the incorporation of Eastern nobles into his administration, had created a growing rift between the king and his oldest friends who remembered the simpler days when he had been merely first among equals. Cletus the Black sat among the honored guests, his scarred features bearing witness to countless battles fought in service to first Philip, then Alexander. This grizzled veteran had commanded the royal squadron of companion cavalry at Granicus, where his desperate sword stroke had severed a Persian's arm just as the enemy warrior prepared to kill the young king from behind. That act of devotion had forged a bond that transcended military hierarchy, making Cletus not just a general but a surrogate father figure. As the wine took hold and voices grew louder, conversation turned to the dangerous topic of Alexander's transformation. Someone praised the king's adoption of Eastern customs as politically wise, suggesting that his divine claims and Persian ceremonial dress elevated him above mere mortals. The comment ignited Cletus's long-simmering resentment at seeing his beloved prince becoming something alien and grandiose. "You speak as if Philip accomplished nothing," Cletus declared, his voice cutting through the revelry like a blade through silk. "This boy forgets that his victories are built on his father's foundations, won by Macedonian blood, not Persian flattery." The hall fell silent as all eyes turned to Alexander, whose face had flushed dark with wine and anger. The king who commanded millions found himself challenged by a man who remembered when he was simply Philip's headstrong son, and the contrast between his assumed divine status and this humbling reminder proved unbearable. "Philip never conquered Asia," Alexander shot back, his words slurring slightly. "Philip never defeated Darius or stood in the palace of Persepolis. These victories are mine, earned by my courage and my strategies." Cletus rose unsteadily to his feet, decades of suppressed frustration exploding into the open. "Your victories, it was Macedonian arms that won them, Macedonian blood that paid for them. And when Persian swords came for your throat at Granicus, it was this hand," he raised his sword arm, "that saved you, not your divine father Zeus." The words struck Alexander like physical blows. to be reminded of his mortality and dependence on others in front of his courtiers, to have his divine pretensions mocked by a man who had witnessed his most vulnerable moments, shattered the carefully constructed image he had built around himself. "Get out," Alexander snarled, lurching to his feet. "Leave my sight before I forget what I owe you." But Cleitus, emboldened by wine and righteous anger, refused to retreat. "The truth stings, doesn't it? You've become so drunk on Persian ceremonies and barbarian adulation that you've forgotten what it means to be Macedonian. Philip would be ashamed of what you've become." The mention of his father's disapproval proved the final provocation. With a roar of incoherent rage, Alexander seized a spear from a nearby guard and hurled it with deadly accuracy. The weapon struck Cleitus in the chest, piercing his heart and sending him crashing to the floor among overturned wine cups and scattered cushions. The silence that followed was absolute. The man who had conquered the known world stood swaying over the body of his friend and savior, the spear still quivering in Cleitus's chest while blood pooled on the marble floor. For a frozen moment, the assembled guests witnessed not a divine king, but a drunk young man who had just committed an irreversible act of violence against someone who loved him. Alexander's reaction to his deed proved as dramatic as the killing itself. His rage instantly transformed into overwhelming horror and remorse. Falling to his knees beside Cleitus's body, he pulled the spear from the wound and turned it toward his own chest, declaring that a man who murdered his friends deserved death. Only the intervention of his bodyguards prevented the king from joining his victim in the grave. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, refusing food and company while alternately calling for his own death and seeking religious justification for his actions. The army waited in stunned silence as their seemingly invincible leader grappled with guilt that threatened to destroy him more completely than any enemy force. When Alexander finally emerged, he had constructed a narrative that preserved his sanity while revealing the dangerous paranoia that would characterize his remaining years. Cleitus had been fated to die, he declared, struck down by divine wrath for insulting the god's chosen instrument. This interpretation satisfied his psychological needs while warning others against similar challenges to his authority. But the damage to Alexander's inner circle proved irreparable, as whispers began to circulate that even the king's oldest friends were no longer safe from his increasingly volatile moods and divine pretensions. When Alexander's own bodyguards turned against him, the paranoia that had been festering since Cleitus's death exploded into a reign of terror that consumed even his most trusted advisors. The royal pages who served Alexander represented the flower of Macedonian nobility, young men in their teens selected from the most prominent families to attend the king personally. These youths carried his weapons, tended his horse, guarded his tent at night, and were being groomed for future leadership positions in the expanding empire. Their proximity to power made them privy to Alexander's most private moments, witnessing the volatile moods and increasing instability that marked his transformation from mortal king to self-proclaimed deity. The conspiracy began to form in the shadows of the royal compound at Bactra during the harsh winter of 327. Led by Hermolaus, son of a distinguished Macedonian general, a group of pages had grown increasingly disturbed by Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his demands for divine honors. These young aristocrats, raised in traditional Macedonian values where even kings could be criticized by their peers, found themselves serving a master who brooked no contradiction and punished perceived slights with terrifying violence. The breaking point came when Alexander struck Hermolaus publicly for a minor breach of court etiquette during a hunting expedition. The humiliation of being beaten like a common slave rather than corrected as befitted his noble birth ignited a fury that spread among his fellow pages. In whispered conversations during their night watches, the conspiracy took shape. They would kill Alexander in his sleep and restore traditional Macedonian governance under more reasonable leadership. The plot's discovery came through betrayal rather than careful investigation. One of the conspirators, either from guilt or fear, revealed the plan to his lover, who immediately informed Alexander's security apparatus. Within hours, the entire group was under arrest, their lives forfeit for contemplating regicide against the man they had sworn to protect. Under torture, a practice previously rare in Macedonian justice but now routine in Alexander's security procedures, the pages confessed not only their own guilt but began naming others they claimed had inspired their rebellion. The name that emerged most prominently from their agonized testimony was Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew and the expedition's official historian. Callisthenes had accompanied Alexander from the campaign's earliest days, documenting victories and composing accounts that glorified Macedonian achievements for posterity. Yet this scholarly observer had become increasingly critical of his king's transformation, particularly the introduction of proskenses, the Persian custom of prostration before royal authority that Greeks and Macedonians considered appropriate only for gods. The historian's opposition to these ceremonies had been both public and principled. When Alexander attempted to formalize proskenses among all his subjects, Callisthenes had refused to participate, arguing that such practices violated the essential equality that defined relationships between Macedonian nobles and their king. His resistance had provided a rallying point for traditionalists who feared their customs were being abandoned for foreign innovations. Whether Callisthenes actually participated in the pages' conspiracy remains unclear even to modern historians. The evidence consisted entirely of confessions extracted under torture from desperate young men who may have said anything to end their suffering. More likely, the pages had simply been inspired by the historian's critiques of Alexander's evolving autocracy, making him guilty of influencing the plot through his ideas rather than his actions. Alexander's response to the alleged conspiracy revealed the depth of his growing paranoia and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his authority. The pages faced execution immediately, their noble birth providing no protection against charges of treason. Their deaths served as a brutal warning to other young aristocrats that proximity to power offered no immunity from royal vengeance. Callisthenes faced a more complex fate that reflected both Alexander's lingering respect for intellectual achievement and his determination to eliminate perceived threats. Rather than immediate execution, the historian was arrested and held under harsh conditions while Alexander pondered his punishment. Ancient sources suggest the king contemplated sending Callisthenes back to Macedonia for trial before the army assembly, but the scholar died in custody before any formal proceedings could be arranged. The circumstances of Callisthenes' death, whether from harsh imprisonment, suicide, or secret execution, became another source of whispered speculation among Alexander's followers. The man who had once recorded their king's achievements with admiring prose had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of maintaining independent thought in an increasingly autocratic regime. These executions sent shock waves through Alexander's inner circle, demonstrating that neither noble birth nor long service guaranteed protection against royal suspicion. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized relationships between the king and his companions gave way to careful formality as men realized that a careless word or gesture might be interpreted as treasonous. But even as Alexander terrorized his own supporters into submission, his ambitions remained fixed on horizons that beckoned beyond the eastern mountains, where rumors spoke of vast kingdoms and fabulous wealth waiting for a conqueror bold enough to venture into the mysterious subcontinent that lay beyond the edge of the known world. The thundering trumpets of war elephants echoed across the Indus River like the voices of ancient gods, announcing that Alexander had entered a realm where the very nature of warfare would challenge everything he thought he understood about conquest. Beyond the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush lay the mysterious subcontinent that Greeks knew only through fantastic tales of gold-digging ants, men with dog heads, and philosophers who could survive without food or water. As Alexander's army descended from the mountain passes into the fertile valleys of the Punjab, they encountered a civilization as sophisticated as any they had conquered, yet utterly alien in its customs, languages, and military traditions. The Indus itself presented a geographic barrier unlike any river the Macedonians had previously crossed. During the spring floods fed by Himalayan snowmelt, the great waterway stretched nearly a mile wide, its muddy brown waters carrying enough silt to turn the surrounding plains into some of the most fertile agricultural land on Earth. Local pilots who guided boats across the treacherous currents spoke of seasonal variations that could transform peaceful streams into raging torrents overnight. Alexander's diplomatic initiatives in this strange new world revealed his growing sophistication as both conqueror and statesman. Rather than simply demanding submission at spear point, he dispatched envoys to various Indian rulers with carefully crafted messages that acknowledged their sovereignty while proposing mutually beneficial alliances. The responses varied dramatically, reflecting the complex political landscape of a subcontinent divided among dozens of competing kingdoms. Some smaller rulers, particularly those facing pressure from more powerful neighbors, welcomed Macedonian alliance as a path to security and advancement. King Ampai of Taxila, known to the Greeks as Taxiles, proved especially receptive to Alexander's overtures. This shrewd monarch recognized opportunity in the Macedonian arrival, seeing potential advantages in allying with these formidable newcomers against regional rivals who had previously dominated local politics. The city of Taxila itself amazed Alexander's companions with its size and sophistication. Streets paved with fired brick stretched between buildings that rose several stories high, while markets offered goods from across the known world: Chinese silk, Arabian incense, precious gems from Ceylon, and spices that commanded fabulous prices in Mediterranean markets. The royal palace complex rivaled anything the Macedonians had seen in Persia, decorated with carved elephants and lions that seemed to watch visitors with jeweled eyes. But it was the military revelations that truly captured Alexander's attention. Indian armies incorporated elements entirely unknown to Mediterranean warfare, most spectacularly the war elephants that served as living siege engines and psychological weapons. These massive creatures, standing twice the height of a man and weighing several tons, carried wooden towers on their backs filled with archers and javelin throwers who could rain death on enemy formations from elevated positions. King Ampai's detailed descriptions of neighboring kingdoms painted a picture of military challenges that would test every lesson Alexander had learned during his previous campaigns. Beyond the Hydaspes River, King Porus commanded forces that included not just dozens of war elephants, but cavalry trained in tactics specifically designed to exploit the terrain and climate of the Punjab plains. Most daunting of all were the seasonal monsoons that could transform warfare itself. During the rainy months, rivers became impassable torrents, while roads dissolved into impassable mud that could trap entire armies. The very weather patterns of this strange land seemed aligned against foreign invaders who lacked intimate knowledge of local conditions. As Alexander absorbed these revelations about the military and environmental challenges that awaited him, urgent reports arrived from his scouts beyond the Hydaspes, describing the impressive preparations that King Porus was making for a confrontation that would test the Macedonian war machine against opponents who possessed both the courage to fight and weapons, unlike anything encountered in the civilized world. When Alexander faced an army of war elephants for the first time, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath creatures that appeared to have stepped from the realm of gods into the world of mortal warfare. The Hydaspes River, swollen by early monsoon rains to twice its normal width, separated Alexander's forces from King Porus and his formidable army on the eastern bank. The Indian monarch had positioned his troops in plain sight of the Macedonians, a deliberate display of strength that showcased elements of warfare entirely foreign to Mediterranean experience. Nearly 200 war elephants formed the backbone of his battle line, their massive forms creating what appeared to be a living wall of ivory and flesh that no conventional army could hope to breach. Behind these creatures stood disciplined infantry formations that rivaled the best Persian troops, while cavalry units on the flanks demonstrated the horsemanship skills that had made Indian warriors legendary across the ancient world. Most impressive of all was Porus himself, a giant of a man who towered above his soldiers even when standing on level ground, mounted on the largest elephant in his army and carrying weapons that gleamed like captured starlight. The tactical challenge facing Alexander defied every conventional approach to river crossings. The monsoon-swollen Hydaspes raged with currents strong enough to sweep away horses and men, while the opposite bank offered no cover for troops attempting to establish a foothold. Most daunting of all, Porus's elephants could simply wade into the river and attack any force attempting to cross, their natural advantages in water making them even more formidable than on dry land. For weeks, Alexander employed the psychological warfare that had become his trademark, conducting noisy demonstrations at various points along the riverbank while his troops made elaborate preparations for crossings that never materialized. Day after day, Macedonian forces would approach the water with great fanfare, forcing Porus to mobilize his entire army to meet an attack that dissolved at the last moment into another false alarm. This campaign of deception served a crucial purpose beyond simply wearing down enemy vigilance. Each feint allowed Alexander's scouts to study the river's characteristics, identifying points where the current ran slower or where islands might provide stepping stones for a determined force. More importantly, the repeated alarms gradually conditioned Porus to view Macedonian movements as elaborate bluffs rather than genuine threats. The actual crossing came on a night when storms lashed the Punjab with rain and lightning that masked the sounds of Alexander's preparations. Selecting a point where a wooded island helped conceal his movements, the king personally led his finest troops across the treacherous waters using a combination of boats, makeshift rafts, and sheer swimming endurance that would have been impossible without years of shared hardship that bound these men to their leader. The crossing itself became an epic of human determination. Soldiers struggled against currents that threatened to dash them against hidden rocks while lightning illuminated the desperate scene in stroboscopic flashes. Several men were swept away by the raging waters, their cries lost in the thunder that rolled across the plains like the voices of angry gods. Yet by dawn, a substantial Macedonian force had established a foothold on Porus's side of the river. When news of the crossing reached the Indian king, he faced the same dilemma that had confounded every opponent Alexander had faced: how to respond to an enemy who achieved the seemingly impossible through audacious execution. Porus dispatched his son with a cavalry force to determine whether this represented the main attack or another elaborate deception, but the resulting clash left the young prince dead and his detachment destroyed, confirming that Alexander himself led this assault. The battle that followed became Alexander's masterpiece of tactical adaptation. Faced with war elephants that could disrupt his traditional cavalry charges, he developed entirely new approaches that turned the enemy's greatest strength into a liability. Rather than engaging the elephants directly, he used coordinated movements to isolate them from their supporting infantry, then attacked them from multiple directions with troops specifically trained for this unprecedented challenge. The Macedonian phalanx demonstrated remarkable discipline in the face of charging elephants, creating predetermined gaps through which the creatures could pass before being attacked from behind by troops who had studied their movements and vulnerabilities. Archers targeted the mahouts who controlled the beasts, while cavalry units struck at infantry formations that had been disrupted by their own elephants' movements. As the battle reached its climax, Porus himself fought with the heroic courage that Alexander had come to expect from worthy opponents. Even wounded, and with his forces disintegrating around him, the Indian king continued to direct the battle from atop his elephant, refusing to abandon his men or his honor. Only when completely surrounded and facing certain death did he finally accept the inevitable. The meeting between the two kings became one of history's most famous examples of respect between enemies. When Alexander asked how Porus wished to be treated, the Indian monarch's response embodied the dignity that had made him such a formidable opponent. As a king, impressed by this courage in defeat and recognizing the political value of magnanimity, Alexander not only spared Porus but expanded his territories, requiring only acknowledgement of Macedonian supremacy. But even as Alexander celebrated this tactical triumph and demonstrated his evolving approach to imperial governance, his thoughts had already turned eastward toward rumors of even greater kingdoms that lay beyond the horizon. setting the stage for a confrontation between his boundless ambitions and the very human limitations of men who had followed him beyond the edges of their known world. For the first time in his life, Alexander heard the one word no army had ever dared speak to him, a simple, devastating no that echoed across the banks of the Hyphasis River like thunder from a clear sky. The river itself seemed insignificant compared to the mighty waterways the Macedonian army had already conquered, just another tributary in the vast network that drained the Punjab plains into the distant sea. But beyond its muddy waters lay the Ganges basin and rumors of kingdoms so vast they made the Persian Empire seem provincial, territories where armies numbered in the millions and elephants blackened the horizon like storm clouds. Alexander stood before his assembled troops on the morning that would define the limits of his earthly ambitions, his scarred body bearing testament to a decade of unbroken conquest. At 29, he commanded an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the edge of the known world, yet his eyes still burned with the insatiable hunger that had driven him since boyhood across 3 continents. The army that listened to his words represented the greatest military force in human history, veterans who had scaled impossible walls, crossed trackless deserts, and defeated enemies their grandfathers could never have imagined. Yet these same soldiers now bore the accumulated weight of campaigns that had stretched far beyond their original expectations. Their faces, weathered by foreign suns and marked by battles without number, reflected a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. For 8 years, they had followed their king beyond the boundaries of the Greek world, trusting his vision even when it led them into dangers that common sense would have avoided. They had fought in climates that ranged from Egyptian furnace heat to Himalayan cold, adapting their tactics to face enemies as diverse as Persian cavalry, Scythian horse archers, and Indian war elephants. When Alexander announced his intention to cross the Hyphasis and continue eastward toward the Ganges, describing the glorious conquests that awaited them in lands where gold was said to be more common than bronze, his words met not the usual roar of approval but a silence that stretched like a physical presence across the camp. The response came not from individual voices but from the collective will of men who had reached their breaking point. They would go no further. The edge in their voices carried the authority of soldiers who had earned the right to speak through blood spilled in service to their king's ambitions. They had given him everything mortal men could give, but they would not give him their lives in pursuit of conquests that served no purpose they could understand. Alexander's reaction to this unprecedented defiance revealed the depth of his psychological dependence on constant forward motion. Rather than arguing or threatening, he withdrew to his tent like a wounded animal, refusing to speak with anyone while struggling to comprehend how mere mortals could thwart the will of Zeus's son. For 3 days, the greatest army in the world waited in tense silence while their king grappled with limitations he had never before acknowledged. No enemy had ever succeeded in stopping his advance, yet his own men had accomplished what Persian numbers, Greek fire, and Indian elephants had failed to achieve. When Alexander finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation, he delivered the most important speech of his career, a passionate appeal that recounted their shared achievements while painting vivid pictures of the wealth and glory that lay just beyond the next river. His words carried the rhetorical power that had once moved assemblies and rallied armies, but they fell on ears that had heard too many such promises fulfilled at too high a cost. The soldiers listened in respectful silence to their king's final attempt at persuasion, then delivered their verdict with the quiet dignity of men who had made an irrevocable decision. They would follow him anywhere he chose to lead them, except forward. They had reached the eastern edge of ambition itself. Alexander's acceptance of this defeat came wrapped in divine interpretation that preserved his sanity while acknowledging reality. The gods themselves, he declared, had spoken through unfavorable omens during his morning sacrifices, indicating that the limits of his conquests had been divinely ordained rather than imposed by mortal weakness. To mark this easternmost point of his empire, Alexander ordered the construction of 12 massive altars dedicated to the Olympian gods, monuments that would stand as proof that a Macedonian king had carried Greek civilization to the very edge of the world. Yet even as he supervised their construction, his eyes remained fixed on the eastern horizon where unconquered kingdoms awaited a conqueror bold enough to claim them. The decision to turn back represented more than a military retreat. It marked the beginning of Alexander's confrontation with mortality and the terrible realization that even divine ambitions must eventually submit to human limitations. Alexander chose to lead his army through hell itself, turning the journey home into the most devastating ordeal of his entire reign, where more soldiers perished than in all his battles combined. Rather than retracing the safe route by which he had entered India, Alexander made a decision that revealed both his unquenchable ambition and his dangerous disconnection from human limitations. He would return to Persia through the Jedrosian Desert, the waterless wasteland of modern Baluchistan that had defeated every previous expedition, including legendary attempts by Semiramis and Cyrus the Great. The desert stretched before them like a vision of the underworld, an endless expanse of sand and rock where the sun blazed with merciless intensity and water sources lay days apart across terrain that had never known human habitation. Local guides warned that even small caravans risked destruction in this furnace of desolation, yet Alexander insisted on leading an army of tens of thousands across wastes that had consumed every previous challenger. Whether he fully understood the desert's dangers or deliberately chose this route as a final test of endurance, perhaps even as punishment for his army's refusal to continue eastward, remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. What is certain is that the 60-day crossing became an apocalyptic journey that transformed conquest into survival and reduced the world's greatest army to a desperate band of refugees fighting for each breath. The suffering began within days of entering the desert proper. The sand grew so hot under the relentless sun that it burned through leather sandals, forcing soldiers to march during the brief hours before dawn and after sunset while seeking whatever shade they could find during the murderous midday heat. Water sources that local maps had promised proved to be dry holes or bitter springs that poisoned rather than refreshed those desperate enough to drink. As the ordeal stretched into weeks, the army began to disintegrate in ways that no enemy had ever achieved. Pack animals collapsed and died, their carcasses becoming food for men who had abandoned their precious plunder to continue the march. Flash floods in narrow canyons, sudden walls of water that appeared without warning from distant storms, swept away soldiers and equipment with devastating efficiency. The civilian followers who had accompanied the expedition for years, the merchants, artisans, and campwomen who had formed the army's mobile community, died in appalling numbers. Ancient sources suggest that 3/4 of these non-combatants perished from thirst, heat stroke, and starvation, their bodies marking the route like gruesome milestones for those who followed. Throughout this nightmare, Alexander displayed both the heroic leadership that had made him legendary and the troubling detachment that marked his evolution from mortal king to divine autocrat. He marched on foot alongside his struggling soldiers, sharing their thirst and exhaustion while refusing water brought specifically for his use. Yet he also maintained elements of Persian royal protocol, traveling with a core elite while thousands perished around them in agony. The psychological impact of witnessing such mass death proved as devastating as the physical hardships. Veterans who had conquered the known world found themselves reduced to scavenging for survival, eating their own transport animals and abandoning treasures they had risked their lives to win. The invincible army that had terrified the civilized world became a column of walking corpses shambling across endless dunes toward a horizon that seemed to recede with each agonizing step. Water became more precious than gold, hoarded in tiny quantities and fought over with desperate intensity. When rare springs were discovered, men trampled each other in frenzied attempts to reach the life-giving liquid, while others died within sight of water they lacked the strength to obtain. Perhaps most haunting were the decisions forced upon survivors by the desert's merciless arithmetic. When water ran low, choices had to be made about who would receive the precious liquid and who would be left to die. Wounded men who could no longer keep pace were abandoned to the vultures, while healthy soldiers pressed forward with the terrible knowledge that they might face the same fate if their strength failed. The ordeal's climax came when Alexander himself collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, his legendary constitution finally succumbing to hardships that had already claimed thousands of his followers. For desperate hours, the fate of the expedition hung in the balance as the man who had conquered empires fought for his life against an enemy that recognized neither royal blood nor divine pretensions. When the survivors finally staggered into the relatively fertile region of Carmania in southern Iran, they resembled walking skeletons more than the disciplined warriors who had entered the desert months earlier. Ancient accounts describe men so traumatized by their ordeal that they continued to hoard water and food even after reaching safety, unable to believe that their nightmare had finally ended. The human cost of this catastrophic crossing defied comprehension. Of the vast multitude that had followed Alexander into the Gedrosian waste, perhaps 1/4 emerged alive, and many of these bore physical and psychological scars that would never heal. The expedition had achieved Alexander's goal of surpassing ancient heroes who had failed to cross the desert, but at a price that raised terrible questions about the value of such victories. As the remnants of his army rested and attempted to recover from their ordeal, Alexander received disturbing reports that would soon demand his attention. News of widespread corruption and rebellion among the governors he had left to rule his empire, revealing that conquering territory and controlling it were entirely different challenges. In the ancient Persian capital of Susa, Alexander orchestrated the most radical social experiment in human history, attempting to forge a new civilization through sacred bonds that would unite former enemies in matrimony and shared destiny. The great hall of the Achaemenid palace blazed with torches and golden ornaments as nearly 100 Macedonian and Greek officers prepared to take Persian wives in a ceremony that defied every convention of ancient warfare and politics. Alexander himself stood at the center of this unprecedented spectacle, flanked by 2 Persian princesses, Statera, daughter of the defeated Darius III, and Parasates, descendant of Artaxerxes III, whose royal bloodlines would bind him irrevocably to the ancient dynasties he had conquered. The ceremony followed Persian rather than Greek custom, reflecting Alexander's determination to honor the traditions of his eastern subjects while creating something entirely new. Fragrant rose petals carpeted the marble floors while incense burned in golden braziers, filling the air with exotic perfumes that spoke of distant lands and ancient rituals. Persian priests chanted blessings in languages that most Macedonian participants could not understand, yet the solemnity of the occasion transcended linguistic barriers. Each marriage represented far more than personal alliance. These unions were designed to create biological bonds between conquering and conquered elites that would make rebellion literally unthinkable. The children of these marriages would inherit both Macedonian military tradition and Persian administrative expertise, forming a new aristocracy that transcended ethnic boundaries while owing ultimate loyalty to Alexander's imperial vision. For traditionalist Macedonians, the spectacle represented a profound betrayal of everything they had fought to preserve. These grizzled veterans had endured years of hardship to establish Greek civilization's dominance over barbarian peoples, yet now found themselves compelled to join bloodlines with the very populations they had conquered. The ceremony forced them to acknowledge Persian noble women as their equals, abandoning cherished beliefs about Hellenic superiority that had sustained them through countless battles. Alexander's own marriages carried particular symbolic weight. By wedding Darius's daughter, he claimed legitimacy as heir to the Achaemenid throne rather than mere conqueror of Persian territory. The union with Parasates connected him to even more ancient royal traditions, creating dynastic links that stretched back through centuries of Persian imperial authority. The wedding feast that followed became an even more revolutionary display of Alexander's vision for cultural synthesis. Rather than maintaining traditional separation between ethnic groups, he arranged seating that deliberately mingled Macedonian officers with Persian nobles, Greek intellectuals with Babylonian priests, and Thracian cavalry commanders with Indian merchants. The resulting conversations, conducted through interpreters and gestures, created unprecedented exchanges between civilizations that had previously viewed each other with mutual incomprehension. As wine flowed and barriers dissolved, Alexander rose to address the assembled multitude in a speech that articulated his most radical conception of imperial governance. He spoke of homonoia, unity of minds, that could transcend the artificial divisions between peoples who shared common humanity despite different languages and customs. This revolutionary idea suggested that former enemies could become partners in civilization rather than perpetual subjects defined by their defeat. The military dimension of this cultural integration had been developing for months before the wedding ceremony. Alexander's controversial policy of training 30,000 Persian youths in Macedonian weapons and tactics had produced a corps of soldiers who could fight alongside traditional units while maintaining their cultural identity. These troops, known as the epigoni or successors, represented the future army of an empire that would draw strength from diversity rather than ethnic uniformity. Even more provocative was Alexander's gradual incorporation of Persian cavalry into the elite companion units that had traditionally served as the army's aristocratic corps. When Persian nobles began appearing in the distinctive armor and formations that had previously been reserved for Macedonian aristocrats, veteran soldiers saw their most precious privileges being shared with former enemies. The psychological impact of these changes created tensions that erupted periodically into open conflict. At Opis, when Alexander announced the discharge of older veterans with generous bonuses, the announcement triggered a mutiny among troops who interpreted it as preference for Persian replacements over loyal Macedonians who had given their best years to his service. Alexander's response to this rebellion combined characteristic fury with theatrical reconciliation. After executing the ringleaders to demonstrate the consequences of defying royal authority, he arranged an elaborate banquet where 9,000 participants, Macedonians and Persians in equal numbers, sat together while he offered prayers for concord between all the peoples of his empire. The ceremony reached its emotional climax when Alexander himself drank from a golden mixing bowl, followed by Macedonian officers and Persian nobles in alternating sequence, symbolically sharing the wine of unity while priests from both cultures offered blessings for their common future. This image, former enemies drinking from the same cup while their king proclaimed their brotherhood, embodied Alexander's vision of an empire united not through force alone, but through mutual respect and shared destiny. Yet even as Alexander celebrated these achievements in cultural synthesis, those closest to him noticed troubling signs that the superhuman energy which had sustained him through a decade of conquest was finally beginning to falter under the accumulated weight of wounds, stress, and the terrible isolation that accompanied absolute power. Even as his body bore the accumulated scars of a lifetime's warfare, Alexander's eyes remained fixed on unconquered horizons, planning expeditions that would dwarf all his previous achievements in scope and audacity. The map spread across his marble table in Babylon showed the Arabian Peninsula stretching southward like a dagger pointed toward unknown lands, its coastlines marked with question marks where even Persian knowledge failed. Alexander studied these charts with the same intensity he had once devoted to battle plans, envisioning fleets that would circumnavigate the peninsula while armies marched across its interior, extending his empire to encompass yet another corner of the world. Arabian conquest represented more than mere territorial expansion. It promised to complete the circuit of the known world by linking his existing dominions with the mysterious lands beyond Egypt's southern borders. Merchants spoke of kingdoms rich in gold and frankincense, of ports that controlled trade routes stretching to the edges of the earth, of peoples who had never bowed to any foreign conqueror. The preparations for this campaign revealed Alexander's evolution into a visionary who thought in terms of global integration rather than simple conquest. Naval yards along the Euphrates echoed with the sounds of shipwrights constructing vessels designed for long ocean voyages, while engineers developed new techniques for supplying armies across waterless wastes that made the Gedrosian desert seem hospitable by comparison. These ambitious plans required coordination on a scale that stretched even Alexander's formidable organizational abilities. Supply depots had to be established across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, while diplomatic envoys attempted to negotiate safe passage through regions where Persian authority had never extended. The logistics alone demanded innovations that would have challenged the resources of entire kingdoms. Yet those who observed Alexander closely during these planning sessions noticed troubling signs that the superhuman constitution which had sustained him through a decade of unbroken campaigning was finally beginning to fail. The accumulated trauma of numerous serious wounds, a pike thrust through his shoulder at Granicus, an arrow through his lung in India, a stone that had fractured his skull during a siege, had left their mark on a body that had once seemed invulnerable. His legendary capacity for wine, which had fueled countless symposiums and diplomatic gatherings, now seemed to require increasingly dangerous quantities to achieve the same effects. Palace physicians whispered among themselves about episodes where their king had consumed enough alcohol to kill ordinary men, yet continued functioning with an apparent normalcy that was itself disturbing. The scars that crisscrossed his arms and torso served as a visible testament to his courage in battle, but they also marked a body that had absorbed more punishment than any human frame was designed to endure. Chronic pain from old injuries required regular medicinal treatments that may have included substances with dangerous long-term effects. More subtle but equally concerning were the psychological changes that accompanied Alexander's physical decline. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized his relationships with officers gave way to an imperial formality that kept even his closest advisors at arm's length. His famous temper, always volatile, became increasingly unpredictable as minor provocations triggered explosions of rage that left courtiers walking on eggshells. Despite these warning signs, Alexander's mental energy remained as formidable as ever. His plans for Arabian conquest formed part of a larger vision that encompassed the creation of new cities, the development of trade routes that would link the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, and the establishment of administrative systems that could govern populations speaking dozens of different languages. The sheer scope of these ambitions revealed a mind that continued to operate on superhuman scales, even as the body housing it showed increasing signs of mortality. Alexander spoke of campaigns that would take years to complete, of expeditions that would explore regions beyond the reach of existing maps, of achievements that would establish his legacy as the greatest conqueror in human history. His officers listened to these plans with the respectful attention that had become mandatory in his presence, but privately many wondered whether their king's ambitions had finally exceeded the boundaries of practical possibility. The Arabian expedition promised to be more challenging than any previous campaign, requiring them to venture into territories where the very climate could prove as deadly as any enemy army. Yet none dared voice these concerns directly to Alexander, whose intolerance for contradiction had made frank counsel increasingly rare in his inner circle. The isolation that accompanied absolute power had created a dangerous bubble around their king, one that filtered out unwelcome truths about both his physical condition and the practical limitations of his expanding plans. As spring arrived in Babylon and preparations for the Arabian campaign intensified, few could have predicted that the greatest conqueror in human history was about to face his final and most implacable enemy, a fever that would accomplish what no human army had ever managed to achieve. The fever that would fell the conqueror of the world began innocuously, striking during what should have been a celebration of friendship and future conquests in the palace where Persian kings had once held court. The evening had started like countless others in Alexander's final weeks, a symposium in the great hall where Babylonian luxury met Macedonian traditions of drinking and debate. Mediager, one of his most trusted companions, had invited the king to join a private gathering that stretched late into the Mesopotamian night. Wine flowed freely as veterans shared stories of distant campaigns while planning the Arabian expedition that would begin within weeks. But when Alexander rose to leave near dawn, something had fundamentally changed. The man who had never shown weakness before his soldiers complained of chills that seemed to penetrate his very bones, despite the warm air that carried the scent of date palms and river water through the palace windows. What began as mild discomfort rapidly escalated into a consuming fever that left the master of 3 continents helpless as an infant. The progression of his illness defied the understanding of even the most skilled physicians who hastened to his bedside from across the empire. Ancient sources describe symptoms that modern medical experts have debated for centuries: a fever so intense it seemed to burn from within, accompanied by severe abdominal pain and a thirst that could not be quenched despite consuming vast quantities of water. For 11 days, the fate of the largest empire in human history hung in the balance as Alexander drifted between consciousness and delirium. During his lucid moments, he continued planning military operations with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him invincible, as if sheer force of will could overcome whatever affliction had seized his body. Palace corridors that had once echoed with the confident voices of administrators coordinating global conquest now whispered with speculation and fear. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones about poison, whether administered by Persian conspirators seeking vengeance, Macedonian rivals positioning themselves for succession, or even his own generals who feared his increasingly erratic behavior. Other theories circulated with equal conviction among those who had witnessed his final weeks. Some blamed the accumulated toll of numerous serious wounds that had never properly healed, creating vulnerabilities that finally overwhelmed his legendary constitution. Others pointed to his prodigious consumption of wine, suggesting that years of heavy drinking had finally exacted their inevitable price. More exotic explanations reflected the multicultural nature of Alexander's court. Babylonian priests suggested divine retribution for disturbing ancient tombs during his exploration of local temples. Greek physicians debated whether the fever represented a natural disease contracted in the swamps around Babylon or some supernatural affliction sent by gods offended by his claims to divinity. The medical mystery deepened as Alexander's condition fluctuated unpredictably. Moments of apparent recovery, when the fever broke and he spoke lucidly with visitors, gave way to relapses that left him unconscious for hours. The physical deterioration was visible and frightening. The robust frame that had endured a decade of unrelenting warfare seemed to shrink before observers' eyes. During his final lucid intervals, Alexander demonstrated the same concern for his empire's future that had characterized his entire reign. He met with his generals to discuss military preparations, reviewed administrative reports from distant provinces, and maintained the royal ceremonies that symbolized imperial continuity. Yet those closest to him could see the terrible effort these activities required from a body that was failing despite his indomitable will. The question that haunted everyone in the palace finally escaped into the lamplit air of the death chamber. To whom do you leave your kingdom? The assembled generals, men who had conquered nations at his command, leaned forward to catch words that would determine the fate of millions across 3 continents. Alexander's response, whether historically accurate or later embellishment, captured the essential tragedy of his situation. The lips that had commanded the loyalty of armies spanning from Greece to India could form only the ambiguous phrase, "to the strongest." These words, pregnant with catastrophic implications for the empire's future, represented either political wisdom or the fevered utterance of a dying man whose thoughts had turned toward the eternal struggles that awaited beyond mortal concerns. As the Babylonian night deepened around the palace, the greatest conqueror in human history drew his final breath in the city where he had planned to rule the world forever, leaving behind a legacy that would reshape civilization and a mystery that would puzzle historians for millennia to come. The moment Alexander's breath ceased, the greatest empire in human history began tearing itself apart as his generals transformed from loyal companions into rival warlords fighting over the fragments of his legacy. In the suffocating heat of that Babylonian summer, the palace that had witnessed the death of gods and kings became a battlefield where words cut deeper than swords and alliances shifted like desert sands. The men who had conquered the known world at Alexander's side now faced each other across a chasm that no amount of shared glory could bridge, the terrible question of who would inherit dominion over territories spanning 3 continents. The immediate crisis centered on succession in an empire that had been held together by the personal authority of one extraordinary individual. Alexander's infant son by Roxana remained in Macedonia, while his unborn child by Statera existed only as possibility. His half-brother Philip Hideous possessed royal blood but lacked the mental capacity to rule effectively. The empire needed a strong hand immediately, yet no clear mechanism existed for transferring power that had been essentially personal rather than institutional. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's signet ring in those final moments, claimed authority as regent over the entire empire. But this assertion met immediate resistance from generals who had governed provinces and commanded armies in their own right for years. Ptolemy controlled Egypt with its vast wealth and strategic importance. Antigonus held much of Asia Minor through military force and local alliances. Seleucus commanded Babylon itself, while Cassander maintained influence in Macedonia through family connections and political networks. Within days of Alexander's death, these titans began maneuvering for advantage in a struggle that would reshape the ancient world. The funeral itself became a focal point for competing claims, as possession of Alexander's body carried immense symbolic value for establishing legitimacy. Ptolemy's audacious hijacking of the funeral cortege, diverting it to Egypt instead of Macedonia, represented the first open act of rebellion against Perdiccas's authority. The wars that followed, known to historians as the conflicts of the Diadochi or successors, raged for decades across the territories Alexander had united. These were not mere rebellions against established authority, but fundamental struggles to define what would replace the personal empire that had died with its creator. Each general possessed legitimate claims based on their service and regional power, yet none commanded the universal respect that Alexander had embodied. The human cost of these succession wars dwarfed anything experienced during Alexander's conquests. Cities that had welcomed Macedonian rule as liberation found themselves repeatedly besieged as rival claimants sought control. Populations that had enjoyed relative peace under imperial unity discovered that their new rulers viewed them primarily as sources of revenue and manpower for endless military campaigns. By 301 BCE, when the last of Alexander's potential heirs was eliminated and the major kingdoms had stabilized their boundaries, the political map of the ancient world bore little resemblance to Alexander's unified empire. Egypt fell under Ptolemaic rule that would endure for 3 centuries. The Seleucid kingdom controlled much of Asia, while Macedonian remained under Antigonid authority. Smaller kingdoms emerged in places like Pergamon and Bactria, each claiming descent from Alexander's legacy while pursuing independent policies. Yet even as his political empire fragmented into warring kingdoms, Alexander's deeper influence began to manifest in ways that would prove far more enduring than any territorial conquest, transforming the very foundations of civilization across 3 continents. From the marble corridors of Rome to the windswept battlefields of Europe, conquerors for the next 2 millennia would measure themselves against a Macedonian king who had died at 32, carrying his name into battles he could never have imagined. Julius Caesar, standing before a statue of Alexander in the Temple of Hercules at Gades, reportedly wept at the realization that the Macedonian had conquered the known world before reaching the age at which Caesar had barely begun his own rise to power. This moment of profound recognition echoed across centuries as ambitious leaders from Pompey to Napoleon carried Alexander's biography into their campaigns, seeking to unlock the secrets of his unprecedented success. The Roman general who would become Augustus kept a copy of Alexander's image on his signet ring, while Trajan launched Eastern campaigns explicitly modeled on Macedonian precedents. When Napoleon stood before the pyramids, addressing his soldiers with the famous words that 40 centuries look down upon you, he consciously evoked Alexander's own pilgrimage to the monuments of ancient Egypt, claiming kinship with the only conqueror whose achievements might rival his own. But Alexander's true immortality lay not in inspiring imitators, but in fundamentally altering the cultural landscape of three continents. The cities he founded became crucibles where Greek learning fused with Eastern wisdom, creating the cosmopolitan Hellenistic civilization that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. Alexandria in Egypt evolved into the intellectual capital of the ancient world, its great library and museum attracting scholars from across the known earth. In Bactria and Sogdiana, his foundations became nodes of a trade network that connected the Mediterranean with China, creating the commercial exchanges that would later be known as the Silk Road. Greek coins minted in what is now Afghanistan carried his image into markets where Chinese silk met Roman gold, while Buddhist monasteries adopted Greek artistic techniques to create the distinctive Gandhara style that influenced religious art across Asia. The cultural synthesis Alexander had envisioned through his mass marriages and integration policies created new forms of art, literature, and philosophy that transcended ethnic boundaries. In the markets of Antioch, Greek merchants conducted business in Persian, while Indian mathematicians worked with Babylonian astronomers to create advances in science that would eventually reach medieval Europe through Islamic scholars. His revolutionary concept of homonoia, unity of minds between different peoples, planted seeds that would bloom in unexpected ways across subsequent centuries. The Stoic philosophy that emerged in the Hellenistic period embraced universal human brotherhood, while early Christianity found fertile ground in cities where Alexander's cultural fusion had already broken down barriers between Greek and barbarian, creating communities accustomed to transcending ethnic divisions. The administrative innovations developed during his reign provided templates for governing diverse populations that influenced the Roman Empire, Byzantine administration, and ultimately the emergence of international law. His practice of respecting local customs while maintaining central authority became a model for imperial governance that persisted long after his political empire had fragmented. Perhaps most profoundly, Alexander transformed human conceptions of possibility itself. Before his conquests, the known world seemed bounded by natural and cultural barriers that no single individual could overcome. Mountains, deserts, and oceans appeared as absolute limits, while differences in language, religion, and custom created seemingly unbridgeable divides between peoples. By demonstrating that these barriers could be crossed, these differences reconciled, and these limits transcended through human will and intelligence, Alexander opened horizons that remained permanently expanded. Every subsequent explorer who ventured into unknown territories, every general who attempted to unite diverse populations, every visionary who dreamed of global integration drew inspiration from his example. The cities bearing his name dotted the ancient world like stars in a constellation, each one a testament to his vision of cultural exchange and human achievement. From Alexandria Eschade on the Jaxartes River to Alexandria in Egypt, these urban centers continued to flourish long after their founder's death, spreading Greek language, art, and ideas while absorbing local traditions that enriched the Hellenistic synthesis. Yet even as we marvel at these tangible legacies, the cities, the trade routes, the artistic masterpieces, perhaps Alexander's greatest achievement was proving that extraordinary individual effort could reshape the course of human civilization itself, a lesson that continues to inspire and challenge us more than 2,000 years after his final breath in Babylon. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval Islamic library, scholars debate whether Iskandar, their name for Alexander, was prophet or tyrant, while across the world archaeologists uncover coins bearing his face in Chinese markets, proving that some flames burned bright enough to illuminate eternity itself. The story that began with a prince's birth amid omens and prophecies has become humanity's eternal tale of ambition and achievement, retold in languages Alexander never heard by peoples he never encountered. In the epic poetry of Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, he appears as a philosopher king seeking wisdom at the ends of the earth. Medieval European romances transformed him into a Christian knight, while Islamic tradition honored him as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran. Modern archaeology continues to unveil the physical traces of his passage across 3 continents. In the Hindu Kush Mountains, shepherds still find coins stamped with his profile, their silver surfaces worn smooth by centuries of handling yet still recognizable. The foundations of his cities emerge from beneath bustling modern metropolises, Alexandria's ancient harbor installations still visible beneath Egypt's second-largest city, while GPS satellites locate the geometric street patterns he planned across Central Asia. His influence permeates philosophy and political thought in ways that transcend historical study. The concept of cosmopolitanism, citizenship in a world community, traces its intellectual genealogy directly to Alexander's vision of cultural synthesis. When modern leaders speak of globalization and international cooperation, they echo ideas first articulated in the marriage ceremonies at Susa, where former enemies became family. The entertainment industry has made him perhaps the most recognizable ancient figure, his story told and retold through films, novels, and video games that introduce each generation to the Macedonian prince who refused to accept limitations. Children who have never heard of Darius or Persepolis know the name Alexander the Great, understanding instinctively that it represents something extraordinary about human potential. Academic conferences convene annually to debate aspects of his career, while military academies study his tactics as relevant to modern warfare. Psychologists analyze his personality, economists examine his administrative innovations, and anthropologists explore his cultural policies. No other figure from antiquity generates such continuous scholarly attention, as if humanity remains convinced that understanding Alexander might unlock fundamental secrets about achievement and ambition. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his enduring presence is how his story continues to inspire individuals facing personal challenges. The boy who tamed Bucephalus by understanding rather than force, the young king who achieved the impossible through audacious execution, the general who shared danger with his soldiers, these images provide templates for overcoming obstacles that seem insurmountable. As we return now to that lamplit chamber in Babylon where our journey began, we understand that while Alexander's body perished at 32, he achieved the immortality that mattered most to a student of Homer's heroes. His name echoes across millennia, not carved in stone but living in human imagination, proof that one extraordinary life, however briefly lived, can expand the boundaries of possibility for all who follow. In the soft shadows of ancient history, his legend whispers still of horizons yet unconquered and dreams yet unrealized.